The room was thick with smoke, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of jazz that filled the air. But everything came to a dead stop the moment the door swung open. The patrons of Harlem's finest establishment went silent. At table 7, Bumpy Johnson sat, the only figure who commanded the kind of silence that made the room pulse with tension. For years, he had been a living legend, a man whose name carried weight and whose reputation was carved into the streets of Harlem like a shadow that never left. But there was one man who had betrayed him, a man who thought he could escape the consequences of his actions. That man, sitting nervously in the corner, had lived free for 11 years. He'd believed that the shadow of Bumpy Johnson, the man he had once called a friend, had long since faded away. But tonight, the razor was back, and there would be no more running. A slow, deliberate step echoed across the floor, each footfall seeming to shake the very foundation of the room. The crowd knew what was coming. They had heard the rumors, the whispers about the betrayals that Bumpy Johnson never forgot. This was the moment when the debts would be paid. This was when the razor would cut through the lies. And then the figure from the shadows moved forward. Bumpy's cold gaze never left his betrayer. The man had thought himself untouchable. But Bumpy wasn't the kind of man you crossed and got away with it. For 11 years, he'd let the streets think he had forgotten. But in reality, Bumpy was a man who kept his scorecard clean. And now it was time to settle up. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a name. He was Harlem. He was the very embodiment of the streets that ran through the heart of the city. Born in 1905, Bumpy had grown up on the hard edges of a world that didn't care about anyone who wasn't willing to fight for their place in it. A man of fierce loyalty and unyielding power, Bumpy was known to all, from the police to the politicians, from the hustlers to the kings of the underworld. By the time the 1930s had turned to the 1940s, Bumpy Johnson was a giant. He wasn't the kind of man you crossed and walked away from. He ruled the streets of Harlem with an iron fist, but he also earned the respect of every soul who entered his domain. The streets whispered his name, not in fear, but in admiration. His strength came from his ability to balance power with a certain code, a code of loyalty that meant everything to him. The political climate of the time was shifting. The Great Depression had brought the city to its knees, but Harlem, under Bumpy's guidance, had become a symbol of resilience. The mob, the Italian families, and the police all knew the game was changing. They all knew that if you wanted to survive in Harlem, you had to respect the rules of the man who owned it. But that code wasn't just about respect. It was about loyalty. And nothing in Bumpy Johnson's world was more important than loyalty. He had built his empire on it, and he wasn't afraid to take action when that loyalty was broken. In Harlem, power wasn't just about strength or wealth. It was about being untouchable. And Bumpy had made himself untouchable in the eyes of those who thought they could challenge him. But there was one man who had thought he could escape, a man who had sold him out, taking money to betray his trust. The man who had betrayed Bumpy Johnson was named Jerome. Jerome had been in Bumpy's inner circle for years, a trusted ally who knew all the secrets of the streets. He had been there when Bumpy had made deals, when Bumpy had built his network, and when Bumpy had made sure Harlem was always one step ahead. But Jerome had grown greedy. In the world of organized crime, loyalty had a price, and Jerome had decided It was time to cash in on his relationship with Bumpy. It wasn't just about money. Jerome wanted power, a seat at the table where Bumpy sat, the seat that only Bumpy could offer. But when the offer came, it came with a price that Jerome couldn't afford to pay. He didn't just cross Bumpy, he betrayed him. And when Bumpy found out, it sent shockwaves through Harlem. For 11 years, Jerome thought he was safe. He'd moved away from Harlem, changed his name, even disappeared into the shadows of the city. He believed that Bumpy had forgotten, or perhaps that Bumpy had simply moved on. But there was one thing Jerome had underestimated. Bumpy Johnson never forgot. As Bumpy stepped toward table 7, Jerome froze. His heart pounded in his chest as Bumpy's cold, calculating gaze never left him. Bumpy didn't need to say a word. The tension in the air spoke volumes. The entire room was silent, the kind of silence that only exists when something monumental is about to unfold. The jazz music seemed to fade into the background as if the room itself had become aware of what was happening. The other patrons, mobsters, businessmen, even a few cops, watched in anticipation. Bumpy stopped at the table, his towering presence casting a shadow over the man who once called him a friend. Jerome's eyes darted around the room, but there was no escape. No words could undo the betrayal, and no amount of pleading would stop what was about to happen. Bumpy leaned in, his voice low, but carrying the weight of a man who had been wronged. "You thought you could walk away from this, huh?" Bumpy's voice was calm, but every word cut through the air like a razor. "You thought I forgot?" Jerome's mouth went dry. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "You're not untouchable," Bumpy continued, his gaze still piercing. "No one is." Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, cold razor blade. The sharp edge glinted in the dim light. For a moment, the entire room held its breath. The razor, Bumpy's signature tool, had returned, and it was clear there would be no escape for Jerome now. In one swift motion, Bumpy flicked the razor open and set it down on the table. "You've had 11 years to think about what you did, and now it's time to settle the score." The silence in the room grew heavier as the cold steel of the razor gleamed under the low lights. Jerome's palms were sweating, his breath short, eyes darting desperately to the men sitting at the surrounding tables. But no one moved. No one intervened. The air was thick with a collective understanding. This was Bumpy Johnson's world, and there was only one rule that mattered: respect. If you broke it, you paid the price. Jerome tried to regain some composure. "Bumpy, please. You know we go way back," he stammered, his voice trembling. "It was just business. You know how things are. It wasn't personal." Bumpy didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed, scanning Jerome's face like a predator sizing up its prey. There was no sympathy in those eyes, only cold justice. "You don't get it, do you?" Bumpy's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper, but every syllable felt like it was carved into stone. "In my world, Jerome, business is personal. It's all personal." He reached for the razor, his fingers brushing the sharp edge with the ease of someone who had used it 1,000 times before. The tension in the room was unbearable now, everyone waiting for the next move. The men at the other tables, who had once heard the rumors about the broken friendship between Bumpy and Jerome, were now seeing the legend himself carry out what they had always suspected was inevitable. Jerome's face was pale. He was a man who had walked away from Bumpy, who had betrayed him for money and power, and now he was realizing the true cost of that betrayal. His back was against the wall, and Bumpy wasn't the kind of man to give mercy to those who broke his trust. "You thought I wouldn't come for you," Bumpy said. "But I don't forget. Ever. And no one betrays me and walks away. Not in this life." With a swift motion, Bumpy pressed the razor's edge lightly against the wood of the table. The sound of metal scraping against the polished surface sent a shiver through the crowd. Jerome's mouth went dry, but he remained frozen. He had no idea how to talk his way out of this. No words could undo the past. Then Bumpy leaned in even closer, the razor now mere inches from Jerome's hand, his breath warm against the betrayer's skin. "You've got two choices, Jerome," Bumpy said, voice laced with cold finality. "You can walk out of here and live the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, knowing I'm coming for you. Or you can make this easy on yourself and make sure you never breathe again. It's your call." Jerome's eyes filled with panic. He had been a man of many words, always able to talk his way out of tight situations. But now he realized the weight of the mistake he had made. There was no negotiating, no escape. This was the end of the line. A bead of sweat ran down Jerome's temple as he looked at the razor, then back at Bumpy. The seconds stretched, dragging on endlessly. He knew the game was over, and he knew there was only one man in this room who could make the final call. For a brief moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for Bumpy's next move. But Bumpy wasn't a man of hesitation. He was a man of action. In a flash, Bumpy's hand shot out, gripping Jerome's wrist. The blade of the razor flicked through the air in a deadly arc, and before anyone could react, it was over. The room erupted in a stunned silence. Jerome let out a strangled gasp as his hand hit the table, the razor's sharp bite having done its work. Blood trickled from the wound, staining the white tablecloth beneath him. But there was no screaming, no frantic desperation. There was only the cold reality of what had just happened. Bumpy stood over him, his expression unreadable. The razor was now back in his hand, gleaming with the evidence of justice served. His eyes met the eyes of the room, the men who had witnessed the moment, the ones who had heard the stories of betrayal and redemption, of loyalty and revenge. Bumpy didn't say a word. There was no need. The message had been delivered in the only language that mattered: action. Jerome collapsed in his chair, clutching his bleeding wrist, his face pale. He had been defeated, not just by Bumpy Johnson, but by the very code of respect that had governed Harlem for as long as anyone could remember. And there was no running from it. Not anymore. The men at the other tables sat frozen, some unsure of how to react, others quietly nodding in respect. The silence lingered for a long time, thick and heavy. Bumpy's reputation had been solidified in that single decisive moment. The respect he had earned over the years wasn't just about his power. It was about his unwavering commitment to the code of loyalty. And when that code was broken, there was no mercy. In Harlem, Bumpy was a living legend, and his actions spoke louder than any words ever could. The aftermath of that night rippled through Harlem like a tidal wave. Word of the confrontation at Table 7 spread quickly, reaching every corner of the city. It wasn't just about what had happened to Jerome. It was about the statement Bumpy Johnson had made. A betrayal had been avenged, and justice had been served in the most definitive way possible. Bumpy's status as a kingpin A man whose name commanded respect from both allies and enemies was now cemented in the annals of history. No one would forget what they had witnessed that night, and anyone who thought about crossing him in the future would think twice. The message was clear. Loyalty meant everything in Bumpy Johnson's world. Betrayal was not something he took lightly, and anyone who dared to cross him would learn the hard way. His justice wasn't about cruelty. It was about ensuring the respect that Harlem deserved. For 11 years, Jerome had thought he could escape. But in the end, there was no escaping Bumpy Johnson's code. This wasn't just about one man's fate. This was about a community's integrity. This was about a legend's unwavering commitment to the people who stood by him, who trusted him, who lived by the same code of loyalty and respect that had built the streets of Harlem. Bumpy Johnson's story wasn't just one of power. It was one of honor, of standing tall in the face of betrayal and making sure that the code was upheld, no matter the cost. Because in Bumpy's world, respect was everything, and sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world what it means to honor that respect. The events that transpired that night at Table 7 became etched in the minds of those who witnessed it, not as a simple moment of vengeance, but as a turning point, an indelible mark on Harlem's story. The tale of Bumpy Johnson, a man whose reputation was built on both his honor and his ability to enforce it, would forever be remembered as a lesson in loyalty. To betray Bumpy wasn't just a business transaction gone wrong. It was a declaration of war on everything that Harlem had come to stand for. As the days passed, the whispers grew louder. Jerome's name was no longer spoken with any respect. In fact, it had become synonymous with weakness. The once trusted ally was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. To break Bumpy Johnson's trust was to enter a world where consequences were swift, unforgiving, and final. His name was synonymous with power, but it was also synonymous with justice. The respect Bumpy commanded was not something that could be bought or manipulated. It wasn't earned in a day, nor was it solidified by simply holding power over people. It was earned through a lifetime of consistency, loyalty, and standing by a code that demanded respect. That was what made Bumpy Johnson untouchable. He didn't rely on fear alone. He built his empire on the bedrock of loyalty. For the men and women of Harlem, Bumpy was not just a figure to fear or admire. He was a symbol of something much greater, a symbol of justice that refused to bend. To those who honored him, Bumpy was a protector of the streets, a figure who stood tall against the corrupt systems that tried to take advantage of them. And for those who crossed him, he was a force of reckoning, the kind that didn't wait for permission to deliver justice. What happened at Table 7 wasn't simply a moment of retribution. It was a statement. Bumpy Johnson had sent a message to everyone in Harlem, from the lowest hustlers to the highest-ranking officials. Loyalty wasn't just something to be talked about. It was a currency. And if you couldn't pay it, there was no room for you in his world. By the time Jerome's blood had dried on the table, the streets of Harlem had already spoken. Bumpy Johnson had reaffirmed his place as not just a kingpin, but as the man who could command a city. His legendary status was no longer just a product of his power. It was a product of his unwavering commitment to a moral code that placed loyalty above all else. And the world would never forget the lesson he taught that night. Because in the end, There are few things as dangerous as a man who never forgets the debts owed to him, especially when that man is Bumpy Johnson. In a world where loyalty can be bought, sold, and betrayed for the right price, it's rare that a man stands for something more. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just about money, power, or respect. He was about a code, a set of rules that demanded unwavering loyalty from those around him. The price of betrayal was steep, and the consequences were absolute. But through it all, Bumpy's legacy remained clear. Respect, loyalty, and honor were the only currencies that mattered in his world. And for anyone who dared to break that code, Bumpy Johnson would be waiting, silent, calculating, but never forgetful. Because legends, in the end, aren't just remembered for their power. They're remembered for their ability to hold the line against betrayal and to stand for something greater than themselves. In the streets of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a name. He was a reminder that no matter how far you run or how long you hide, some debts will never be forgotten and some legends never die.